This is the single most important, proudest moment of my life.
It is considered by many to be one of the most significant political events in 20th century Louisiana. On January 5th, 1973, 132 men and women convened in Baton Rouge to begin rewriting our state's outdated 1921 Constitution. 1 year later, their work was completed, and Louisiana had a new Constitution. Join us for a conversation with the leaders of that convention and the delegates who helped create the Constitution we have today.
Good afternoon to all of you all, and I would like to thank you all for being here as we share some remembrances of a very significant time period in Louisiana some 40 years ago. This week, of course, the historical importance of events from earlier times have riveted even a younger generation. We commemorate today the 150th anniversary of Lincoln's Gettysburg Address. The stirring words 77 years ago, our forefathers brought forth on this continent a new nation conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. Of course, even Lincoln said the world will not little note nor long remember what we say here. But of course, those ringing phrases are part of our shared history. And on Friday, we will remember the 50th anniversary of the assassination of President John Fitzgerald Kennedy. If we are old enough, we can remember exactly where we were when we first heard the news. I will remember as a freshman right in that building across the hall, remembering it as if it were yesterday. But if you've been watching the documentaries, many of the film that we see makes it seem like it was in a time very long past, a distant time. However, it was just 10 years later on this historical timeline we're talking about in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, that many of you in this room gathered for the Constitutional Convention of 1973. The work you did together changed Louisiana history and affects government and Louisiana citizens in thousands of ways. From our tax system to the way we govern higher education and fund elementary and secondary education. Let's take a look at this short background video that was produced by LSU and narrated by another young journalist who reported on CC 73, and then I married him 10 years later. So let's take a look.
In 1973, Louisiana's Constitution was barely a constitution at all. Adopted in 1921, it was ancient and out of date. After more than 50 years, it had ballooned to 250,000 words. It had been amended more than 500 times. A prominent political scientist once called it one of the most curious documents ever to be given the label Constitution. Consider that the U.S. Constitution has only about 6,700 words. That made it 33 times smaller than the 1921 Louisiana Constitution in 1973. By 1973, it was clear Louisiana's Constitution needed change. Some political leaders had tried to fix the 1921 Constitution. In 1956, for instance, the legislature passed a bill allowing for a convention to draft a new constitution. But voters shot it down. By the early 1970s, the document was drowning in amendments and legalese. The need for revision was apparent. Representative James Dennis of Monroe began to push for a convention, primarily so that he could amend legislation in his own parish regarding the Firemen and Policemen Civil Service Board.
Judge Dennis, when he was a legislator, had been called on by one of his constituents to provide a pay raise for them, and when he called the Legislative Council and asked them to draft a bill, they let him know that it would have to be a constitutional amendment. He just couldn't believe it.
Dennis's proposal met opposition from the powerful head of the Louisiana AFL-CIO, Victor Busey, and then Governor John McKithen. Eventually, they relented. They ultimately backed a bill that allowed for the creation of a Constitutional Revision Commission, which would attempt to revise the 1921 Constitution. The 48-member commission met in September of 1970, but it had trouble organizing an efficient method of revision. As election season approached, most of the members were more concerned with re-election than constitutional revision. Again, the Constitutional Convention was shelved. In 1972, though, voters elected a new governor, Edwin Edwards, who campaigned on the need for a new constitution.
And I think while he did campaign on that, he also campaigned on the executive branch reorganization. When he got elected, he found out real quickly that without amendments to the Constitution, he couldn't reorganize the executive branch, and I think that just sort of consolidated his efforts and belief that we needed a new Constitution.
Immediately after his election, Edwards said he would ask legislators to call for a convention in January 1973. It would last no longer than a year. The legislature acted, passing a bill in the 1972 session, setting up the structure for the Constitutional Convention that would convene on January 5, 1973, and complete its work on January 4, 1974. 132 delegates composed the Constitutional Convention. 105 were elected, one from each of the 105 House districts, and Governor Edwards appointed the remaining 27. Then House Speaker Bubba Henry was elected to chair the convention. For a year, a robust group of Southern personalities gathered and clashed over the creation of a new constitution for Louisiana.
Ultimately, there were a lot of compromises and yet a lot of great principles that people stood up for.
We made some substantial changes and some improvements in the document. It was decidedly shorter than the old 1921 Constitution.
Funds and organization for the convention were problems. Delegates were suspicious of one another. Most of the early sessions were extremely long and drawn out, prompting one political observer to call this the most boring public meeting yet. 19 days into the convention, financial reports indicated that there probably was not enough money to complete the revision work. Projected cost had jumped to $2.29 million.
They would get teams to come out and play to see how much money they could raise. So we in the convention decided that we would go out there and make up a team if we could play the Golden Girls of LSU. And they agreed to set it up, and I think we raised $4,000 or $5,000 as a result of it, and had a lot of fun. And it was just an interesting event.
When the delegates completed their work in January of 1974, just a few weeks over their allotted time, they presented Louisiana's citizens a new and much shorter and tighter constitution, one that completely reorganized the state government and the legislature.
I think that was about the finest group of people I've ever known in a deliberative body, and we had such good delegates to the convention.
It was one time when people from all walks of life in Louisiana could come together and really work in a positive way for the future of our state.
Well, you know, probably more than half of the residents of Louisiana were born after the work of the convention was completed, and certainly every student at LSU was born well after the Constitution was passed. So here on this 40th anniversary, let's remember some of it, look back at some of the highs, perhaps some of the lows, and we certainly have a great, able group here with us on the stage to talk about all this. Let's begin with the why really did we need a new Constitution? We heard a little bit about it in the video, but what was wrong with the old one? Bubba, why?
Well, I think when Governor Edwards addressed the sessions of the legislature as to some of the reasons why, he pointed out that, for one thing, there were 179, I think, references in that 21 Constitution of other material that you had to read before you could interpret what certain parts of the Constitution said. You've already heard that there had been over 800 amendments that had been offered to the 21 Constitution, and 560 some of those, I think, had passed. And the people of Louisiana were getting tired of voting on amendments. One time they turned down 53 amendments out of 53 amendments. Several other times it was almost that bad. And people had realized for about 20 years in this state that the 21 Constitution was already outdated, and that we needed to fix what had been wrought on the people in 1921.
Anybody want to add to that? I remember people just voting everything down. So it was sort of like, wasn't that a public sort of condemnation of perhaps we need to do something? I mean, it was right. a groundswell, if you will.
That's what brought it home to me. I was in the legislature with Bubba. It was our first session in 1968, and I introduced one of those amendments. That was the one to raise the pay of the fire and police civil service clerk in Monroe. I was surprised that it had to be in the Constitution, so I put the bill in, and it was voted down with the other 52. And a reporter called me and said, "What do you think?" And I said, "Well, maybe we need a new Constitution." He put it on the wire, it went all over the state, and I said, "Man, I better go study this." And I was lucky. I had a protege of the Constitution written by the Louisiana Law Institute that was on my law firm's bookshelf, and I started reading, and I said, that's right, we do. It's much too long. It also dedicates 2/3 of our revenues. It ties the hand of the legislature. Of course, some people wanted them tied, but I thought in order to give flexibility and good government to the state, we needed a better Constitution that would allow for the legislature to make changes instead of promoting, putting them on the voting machine.
I wasn't an office holder then, but I remember traveling the state with Edwin, who was running for governor, and he made this one of the planks that I thought differentiated him from the other candidates. And he would tell time and again how our own Constitution would contradict itself, and that there was no clear message. And the bottom line to me was that I got the spirit that it was a great idea. And then the final point that I'll make has already been made a little bit, is the people were losing confidence in all elected officials, in part because of the stumbling block of the Constitution itself.
Well, so we're talking about you, Governor Edwards, but as you look back on this, was that one of the key planks of your campaign? Does it, in retrospect, look more important or less important?
It was, public affairs research was in its infancy then, but it was the good government group in Louisiana at the time. They made a number of recommendations about what to do to make government and the state better. And I, in my platform, running for governor, adopted them. And not many people remember it, but before I got out of my first term, Parr had issued a report saying that every recommendation that the group had made had either been implemented or was in the process of being implemented during my first term as governor. And of course, I never got a title as a good government fellow, thank goodness, because people just want a pretty good government, and that's what I gave them. But anyway, I thought it was important for a number of reasons, and of course, you asked what was wrong with it. Well, the other Constitution was like some of us. It was kind of old and a little confusing and had a great past but no future. And so we had to determine what to do about it. Now, let me say something in this forum. The first problem that I had with the whole concept was that the old Constitution had no provision, in spite of all the amendments and all the words, had no provisions for a process to rewrite the Constitution. There were provisions for amendments, but not for rewriting a whole Constitution. And I got into a number of arguments with legal scholars and with Parr and with others when I said, well, look, let's just pass an act of the legislature. We'll adopt a convention. We'll write a constitution and submit it to the people for ratification. There was a great hue and cry that was unconstitutional. You can't write a new constitution that way, and it would not pass constitutional muster, and everybody knew it would be attacked and ratified or declined by the courts. My point was this: okay, there's no provision for writing a constitution. Take my provision. Let's do it. We write a constitution, we submit it to the people. If they don't like it, they decline to adopt it. Therefore, it's a moot question as to whether or not that's a good way to write a constitution or not. But if they pass the Constitution as proposed, that means they have ratified it, and ipso facto, the method which I selected would be validated. And of course, that's what the court held. Now, that's one of the few times in my life when I had a good idea.
Well, you know, one of the things that seems so interesting about this, looking back on it, was there was a lot of controversy about whether the legislature themselves could have the Constitutional Convention, or whether you had to elect all of these new delegates. Now, that was controversial, and how many of you were elected up here?
Everybody but me.
Everybody but Mary. And Mary, that was interesting. What did you feel like that was a significant thing when you were?
I did. Buddy did, but
Buddy.
I didn't. No, Buddy stood up when we were meeting at the Supreme Court before we were ever really constituted and talked about all the corrupt appointed delegates. And, I went up to him afterward and I said, Buddy, get to know us a little, please. He told me tonight that after 40 years he's decided I wasn't all that corrupt.
That's not what he told me.
Well, one of the interesting things looking back on it is there wasn't a lot of there was some minority representation, Johnny, but tell me about that.
We had just elected 8 African-American legislators from across the state. Prior to that, since Reconstruction, there were only maybe 2 before was elected, and the governor appointed, what I believe, 4 to increase our numbers to 12, Tom Velasquez, and it gave us an opportunity, particularly as African Americans and as a large percentage of the population of the state of Louisiana, to be involved in the construct of the Constitution of the state, and that never had happened, since Reconstruction. And while we were interested in obviously a strong Bill of Rights, strong governance, protection for Southern, elementary education, it gave us an opportunity to contribute our thoughts and our beliefs regarding organizations of local government, of the judiciary, and all the other aspects of the Constitution.
Well, it gave an opportunity for some young people to be elected, and one of those young people was Woody Jenkins. How old were you?
Well, I was 25, and it
20?
was a tremendous opportunity for a young person to be elected. There were several elected in their 20s, but I had just been elected to my first term in the Louisiana House, and I had a lot of skepticism about a constitution that would be written under Governor Edwards with his more liberal perspective, and with 27 appointed delegates that he would name, although some groups had something to do with some of those appointments. But I was concerned about it. But once it was decided, I decided to weigh in and try to be elected from my North Baton Rouge, Estruma area, and I'm so grateful to the people there for giving me that opportunity.
In looking at some of the research, and I recall this, I have vague memories of this as I was doing some radio reporting, and we didn't have videotape in those days, we just had films. I remember you discussing passionately the Bill of Rights. Now, why did we need a separate Bill of Rights?
It's something that a lot of times people don't realize, but the U.S. Constitution, as it was originally formulated, was without a Bill of Rights, and then the people demanded a Bill of Rights. But when it was passed, it was a restriction on Congress. Congress shall make no law, and then whatever prohibition it would be was provided in that. And that didn't really apply to the states. It really wasn't until the 14th Amendment was passed after the Civil War that some provisions of the U.S. Constitution were made applicable to the states. And even by 1972, there were some provisions that had still not been made applicable, like the Second, Third, Seventh Amendments to the Constitutions were not applicable to the states, and portions of the Fifth and Eighth Amendment were not applicable. So really, people in Louisiana and the various states did not have all of the rights and liberties when it came to actions by local government and state government that we thought they might have as citizens of the United States. So in addition, there were a lot of things in our federal Constitution that were not even dealt with, such as the right to property, which is one of the things that were most important. So we needed a Bill of Rights to make all of our rights applicable to our citizens here in Louisiana.
Well, the interesting thing for me also was that you had hearings around the state. I mean, there was an attempt to have the citizenry buy in. Tell me about those. Bubba, you said you had some unflattering things about some of the people who came to some of those public hearings to testify.
Well, they were probably some ornery people that came to those. They weren't lobbyists, Senator. They weren't even registered. The thing is that we were charged with the responsibility of organizing a constitutional convention and writing the document. And right out of the box, we were at cross purposes with one another because it was the intent of the legislation that we had passed that after we got together and organized the convention and elected officers, that the executive committee would hire a staff, and that the convention would recess and go home, and the staff would write the document, and the convention would come back on August the 5th, I believe, and debate the articles of the document. Now, this was what the governor and what I thought was going to happen, but it was obvious before January the 3rd when we came in, it ain't going to be that way, because the Buddy Roemers of the world had a different opinion, and the Pat Junos of the world had several different opinions, and Judge Dennis might have had yet another, and Lord only knows what they were thinking in West Wego, Senator. But when we came together, the notion was that we were going to organize our own committees. We would draft our own rules, which we had to do, and which we did. But those committees were going to work as legislative committees, and they were going to draft the various sections of the document. And then when we got done with that, by the time we got to July the 5th, we could debate the final Constitution. Governor Edwards, you may or may not recall this, Governor. I'm not sure. I know how you felt about it. He didn't like that, and he thought we were going to waste some time, and we didn't have any money, and he had to provide some additional money for that. But to generate public support, we thought it best that we go to the various sections of the state and meet with the people. And I didn't figure too many people would show up, but some places a good crowd did. Most places too many people didn't. But the press covered all this, and it gave us, I think, a goodwill with the people. And we ran into some real wingnuts around the state, but you know, there were wingnuts in the convention to some extent, and so the state was well represented.
Is that the way you remember it, Governor? Were you outdone? You're sort of thinking, what are they doing? What are these people?
What Bubba hasn't said is that also increased their per diem.
Just to take the count.
And what Bubba's not saying is that the nuts need to be represented also. We have to make sure that we're covered. The unique part, I think, of our Constitutional Convention was that it was a unicameral body, unlike as we know it now between the House and the Senate, and a lot of times the House can correct errors the Senate makes, or generally it's the other way, the Senate corrects the mistakes that the House makes. But it was such a unique group of people, and I think the opportunity the governor had to appoint some extra people who weren't elected gave a broader perspective of bringing in good views, a cross-section of it, allowing for women, minorities, and others to be appointed that maybe couldn't get elected. I got elected in the same House district. That's how you ran in the House districts. And I think then you qualified, and it cost you $5 to qualify. Well, lo and behold, I had 14 opponents, and I think I ended up beating them all in the first primary, but by 52%. But that was 52% was Alario. So I mean, West Wego, it's a big name. But to look back at how successful all of those people came together in the different walks of life, it wasn't as complicated, I think, then as it is now. There wasn't a Tea Party or a right-wing group or left-wing group. I guess then it was conservative Democrats that were called at the time, but folks brought in those strong views, and it's some kind of way, a democracy, if you give it time, will work, and it certainly worked in this case. A constitution should provide for your basic form of government, first of all, and the second part it ought to do is to provide a protection for the people from that same government. And I think this one accomplished that and provided for that. But none of this would have happened without the debate going on during the gubernatorial elections prior to this coming on, and Governor Edwards putting this in his platform, and not only putting it in for a politician to live up to what he promised the people to do and to bring it forward. And I think that speaks well of the way he conducted him. He's guilty of that part. He will admit that's the only thing.
Well, Governor,
it turned out very successful.
Well, Governor, you were this is the first term, you're in there, you're not as familiar with everything, and here is this Constitutional Convention going on, and it looks like they're going to take a lot longer than we ever thought they were going to. They're costing you money. What are you thinking about this when you're sitting there?
Well, I want to point out that I think Bubba's right about one thing. These town hall meetings really didn't contribute at all to the sanctity of the document. But what it did, it made people everywhere in the state aware of the fact that this process was ongoing. and it made them curious about what they were doing, and they became more informed about it. And I think that was one of the key elements that made it possible to pass the Constitution after it was written. Now, I left up to, by the way, Bubba was not elected. He announced himself as chairman, and that's how it happened. But I left it up to him and his committees to decide what they wanted to put into the Constitution, with some exceptions, of course, where I took a position. And I want to make this observation. The Bill of Rights, the civil rights platform in our Constitution, written largely by a committee headed by Camille Gravel, in which I participated, became a model, and a number of states adopted it verbatim after that, after it was passed. And I think that, and it's in effect today, basically as it was written, and I think that is a very significant improvement that was made in the new Constitution. But by and large, we had a couple of issues that we just couldn't settle among ourselves. One of them was the multiple college boards. I recall that, and the other one I think had something to do with right to work.
Let's talk about the higher.
But anyhow,
Yeah.
I suggested, and we did do that, we had the body of the Constitution, and then there were options where people could vote yes or no. Like I supported the concept of one governing body for all college institutions. It was opposed by a number of people for a number of reasons. Practically everyone who came from an area where there was another college, Ruston, Monroe, Lafayette, Natchitoches, wherever, opposed the idea because they felt maybe with some justification that LSU would end up taking over everything and controlling the whole process. So there was a great deal of opposition to it. So I suggested we make it as an alternate, yes or no on it. And of course it failed because it was, at the time, while it was a great idea and should have been adopted, it was not popular at the time. And I know that there have been several efforts, you would know better than I, John, several efforts since to try to have one board, but it never was successful.
I tried, couldn't get it.
We've tried several efforts, and it came to the same fate as it happened with that. It's just
I
a
mean,
difficult thing because you've got each of those universities and systems throughout the state have their own constituency, and it's very important in some parts of the state. It's basically the economy of that part of the state, so they're very sensitive about it.
I like to look at who's worked it. North Carolina, 27 years ago did it. They are light years ahead of us. They actually coordinate among all the universities. They actually get more for the dollars they spend. And Edwin came to the convention and made 10 points that he'd like us to review. And at each one he said, it's my preference not to have this in the Constitution. It doesn't belong here, these tax rates and this and that. But he said it's got to pass. So that's what you've got to look at. And one of the things that I remember Edwin said, and I admire so much, and I thought it was true then, and I know it's true now, we'd be better off, including LSU, if we worked together. How about that for an idea?
I'd like to follow up on something Governor Edwards said about the Bill of Rights, and we call it, of course, the Declaration of Rights in our Constitution. There was something about it that allowed conservatives and liberals to work together, and there is a trend within the conservative movement of really civil libertarians, and there's a trend within the liberal side of civil libertarians. And our Bill of Rights Committee contained both, and what we were able to agree on was that the key thing in the Constitution was to tie so-called rights to the individual, to make them the rights of the individual. The previous Constitution had talked in terms of group rights. It had talked about the right of the people to keep and bear arms, and words like that. We made it the right of each person or the right of each citizen. Well, this is something that brought us together, and then we made the Bill of Rights in the Constitution self-operative. In other words, you didn't need to pass another law. It's in effect, and if someone is violating your rights under color of law, you have an action to go in and stop it. Whereas under the old Bill of Rights, it was really more words on a page, but because of it being group rights, there were no real rights that you could protect in the courts.
Give us a sense of this whole higher education battle on the Constitutional Convention floor. Did you have lobbyists there actually in the convention? Did you? Oh, yes, you did.
All over the place.
All over the place.
We had coalitions, though. It was interesting because there was some the folks that had to do business with the Public Service Commission had a deal that they wanted to get adopted, and that was automatic rate increases. And they began to work with the AFL-CIO and the banks, and there were several groups that came together. And part of the deal around, at least it looked like to me, was that the LSU board had to remain as the LSU board, and they didn't want any other governing boards in higher education. The only day that I missed in the convention, though, there was one of the delegates that had his idea about an additional board that we didn't have, and that was when Representative Johnny Jackson put in a piece of an amendment to create the Southern Board, and I thought that may be the thing that would help defeat all the boards that we had been considering, but had no effect at all. But there was more interest in support for multiple boards than I could imagine, but it was because I think of the different groups that had coalesced to get help in.
Well, Bubba, I think it was fear-driven that damage would be done to my university unless we had the board. So I can understand that, and it's hard to show the goodness that can come from a coordinated board. We just didn't do it.
Well, that was a concern of, even among the African American delegation, some were for like Alphonse. Right. Alphonse took the lead on with the one board, LSU, but there was a large expressed concern that Southern University would lose out under these sort of arrangements, and that's why we offered it to give constitutional protection, because heretofore you could, by a simple majority vote of the legislature, really abolish one of the historically black universities. And that was, I was telling my friend Lightman here, that was one of the major points of that we think helped pass the Constitution, because people felt that Southern University would at least constitutionally be protected. May not be politically protected or otherwise, but constitutionally protected.
Well, speaking about not being protected from like budget cuts, higher ed is not. And the Constitution seemed to lock in some very specific funding mechanisms. Talk to me about that and how that worked. Because the taxing structure was
in my judgment, one of the worst economic or financial problems a governor has is, in the event of a shortfall, he is restricted to two very sensitive areas: higher education and health care. And the other agencies are protected from interim cuts, and therefore a governor faced with an obligation to balance the budget has to take from these two areas, and that's not a very popular thing to do, as the present governor has found out.
Do you wish that had been changed?
Biggest part that now is dedicated in the Constitution that wasn't part of this original Constitution was an amendment that was added later on, was to put elementary and secondary education into the minimum foundation formula into the Constitution. That was a result of, because
we
some
didn't
tough.
Do that, did we, John?
No,
that wasn't in the original.
This Constitution didn't do it. Some people who served in the legislature after that did. I'm not sure if it was part of it, but it came about because we had some severe budget cuts, as we had running into now, and you run through in cycles like that. And elementary and secondary did get cut, and there was a big upheaval about, heck, you cut them, and they didn't want to be cut in the future. So it went out to a vote of the people, and they overwhelmingly put it in the Constitution. So now over $3 billion is now dedicated in the Constitution that wasn't dedicated when this group had originally sought. So it got worse in dedication-wise as
progressively. It just continued on.
Yes.
Well, and that's the philosophical and governmental question about a Constitution that's subject to endless amendment. Is that you focus attention on the amendment and lose sight of the whole body. And John, that's just the point you're making. I mean, if my funds are not protected and yours are, then I want my funds protected. And you make that case to the people about this retirement system or that fund, and the people said, yeah, let's put that in the Constitution. What, to amend the Constitution requires 2/3 vote of the legislature and a vote of the people again. So you lose the flexibility that life demands when you don't know what the future holds. And that's the problem with the old Constitution, and will become a problem with our Constitution relatively soon if we keep amending it 10 or 15 times a year.
At one point, we said if you weren't in the Constitution, you needed to be under a federal court order. That's the only way you got money. And I was hoping maybe corrections was under a court order and everything else was locked into the Constitution. So taking away flexibility. What was the hardest vote?
One other thing on that about budget. Because I think from the standpoint of the average taxpayer and average citizen, it's very important that this Constitution has very strong protections for the taxpayer, because it requires a balanced budget. So we can debate and argue things like education funding and health care, but the key is, unlike the federal government, it requires a balanced budget, and there are some very strict safeguards to require in what the governor submits as a proposed budget, what the legislature has to pass, and what can then be done. So we're not running up big deficits for the taxpayer, and also if we want to raise taxes, there's some restrictions on how taxes can be raised. So we have far more protections on the taxpayer in this state than in the federal government and most states.
And I wish we had it nationally.
Nationally.
Quite frankly. I mean, we're out of control, but we'll give that speech later.
What was the hardest vote each one of you had to take in the convention? Mary, what was it? They were all easy.
You notice when the introductions came on, you had judges and senators and governors, and then there's Mary. So I didn't have any hard votes because I wasn't elected to anything. And I hadn't long been working for the city government. At one point, but later when I was lobbying the legislature, he said, you don't have to put this administration on the side of every good government thing that comes along. But we didn't have that conversation till later. So I didn't have any hard votes. Everything was easy for me because I had no career to suffer the consequences.
But what was the experience like for you? I remember going into it, you all met in the White House Inn, which has now didn't they knock it down right towards the end of but before you finished almost. No, it was still there?
No, it was still there.
It was still there.
If you'll remember, their slogan is where every guest is treated like the president. And you remember what was happening to the president in 1973?
Yes, exactly. I remember that as well. What was the environment like? Was it? Did you all get along or not? I mean, John, what was it like?
I think we had a good congenial group. They were folks I think just had good senses of humor, which you need to have in a body like that to make things work. We had them from all walks of life that contributed to each other. We got to visit with people in North Louisiana. I grew up in the South all my life, and you find out people care about the same things. They want their children educated. They want the opportunity to have a job, and you get to find, well, heck, this guy's not so bad after all, and we all got to liking each other. I can't remember what was the specific tough vote. I know, I've been around long enough to know if this was a tough vote, just wait till tomorrow. There'll be another one just as bad. So the issue I recall back in Jefferson Parish, where I'm from, was the homestead exemption. There was a move on, and I think Parr was leading the fight to do away with the homestead exemption and do it. And the big one turned out to be one of the delegates. I think Governor Edwards might have appointed Lawrence Shahardy, not the young boy, but his dad before him, who was a big leader in trying to raise the homestead exemption. And it was a big issue for us, and that came to some compromise. It wasn't what I think some people would have liked, but therein, I think it was one of those Christmas ornaments that got put on the whole Constitution that made it passable to the people. Had we restricted or taken something away from them, I think they'd have turned it flat down. It's just one of those things. Same thing as not protecting Southern University. I think that brought a certain group of people in the umbrella and made the whole thing work. It's what makes democracy such a beautiful thing.
I thought it was a wonderful atmosphere myself, because people were there. They knew they couldn't run for re-election. And it was an opportunity for people to really leave a legacy for our state and to do something that would last. And so they were working together very amicably. I didn't have any hard votes. I thought they were pretty clear for me, but a lot of people did have hard votes.
The hardest vote in the convention, I believe, was whether or not to put judicial retirement into the Constitution. And I recall that it was being heavily lobbied, and judges naturally were going to be for that, and I understood that. but there were a group of us that were lobbying hard against it. And Camille Gravel didn't like it, and some of the delegates that are grinning here tonight didn't like it, and we began to work on it. And Chris Roy from up in Rapides Parish, we couldn't get his vote, and he had agreed or was about to agree to vote with the judges. And we decided that the way for him to save himself was to sit in the chair, and he was one of the vice presidents, chairs of the convention. Now, whether you all remember this or not, some of you are chuckling, you remember it. And we put him in the chair because we said, you're safe. You're not going to have to vote unless there's a tie. And Pointer turned on the machine, and it took an eternity. And said, what is it? He said, it's a tie vote. And Chris said, what do I do? And I said, you vote with us. And he voted against it. And I think that time we prevailed, but later on I think that it ended up being put in the document. But I think that was one of the toughest votes for a lot of people.
You know, I didn't have, I'm like Woody, I don't remember a tough vote. They were all difficult for me. I'm not an attorney, and I've never been in elected office. I was 28 when I was elected and one of the younger guys, not the youngest. But I learned so much. I mean, it was invaluable to me to meet the men and women that I met, and for the rest of my life to work with them on environmental control, on education reform, on tax reform, before I was governor, while I was governor, after I was governor. I mean, it was the most powerful single event in my adult life in terms of a job or elected office. Isn't that interesting? The Constitutional Convention. And I had no power. I wasn't chairman of any committee. I didn't have the governor's blessing. I ran to be elected. And I beat a group of lawyers in Bossier. I was lucky. I think I won because I was a non-lawyer. But I learned so much from that Constitutional Convention. And while I was governor, I could not have done the things that we were able to do without a Tom Casey. And I didn't know Tom Casey from a rabbit until I met him at the Constitutional Convention. My roommates were Wendell Gaucher and Don Kelly. I mean, you could not have two more powerful and different guys than those two trial lawyers. And here's a country boy from Elm Grove, Louisiana. It was powerful.
I guess it was the same thing with us as African American delegates. You know, most of us from urban areas. We too got exposure, let me just put it like that, to representatives from areas that we had no concept of. Guys from Southwest Louisiana, guys from way up north, people who brought issues that heretofore we had not been able, saw necessity to deal with, but as we heard the debate and the discussion, we became enlightened and really began to get a feel about the issues. Alvin Singletary, the mayor with his red jacket at the convention. Yeah. Some of the most colorful guys I've met, I met during the convention. And some of the guys who I thought I would never get a vote from were the ones who really were there when we needed it, particularly for the concerns. And obviously, during that process, we were able to trade off and to really get an appreciation of, for example, local governments, the right of local governments to incorporate. I never forget, Mary, during the municipal, the biggest fight that I personally had was Alan Perez. Because he was representing a parish that really had unincorporated cities. But there were other parts of the state that was really pushing for a provision to allow for annexation and for incorporation. And so, we were able to bond with them and to at least expand the principle during the Constitution of the right of under certain regulations, the right of certain areas to incorporate.
Well, do you think that the time has come for us to look at a new, does this current Constitution that you adopted with all of its amendments now, how does it need to be changed? Or is it time for a new constitutional convention?
I think it's time for a debate in this next gubernatorial election for that issue to come up. We have some kind of way managed to dedicate more funds than we ought to. We have set up our tax code in such a way that it's very difficult to lower some taxes and raise some, and to make it all jive out. So I'm hoping in the next gubernatorial election that it'll be part of the debate and folks can talk about it and get the public interested, as Governor Edwards did back in that time. And it's going to take a leadership from the top to make this happen. Individual legislators, while we may be able to have some sway, don't have that kind of a sway to make the public very interested in this type of debate. So I'm hoping that it does become a big issue.
But
how do you feel?
Don't forget how difficult it's going to be. There were a lot of constitutions proposed in other states before ours that failed, and I don't think one has passed since, correct me if I'm wrong. So passing a state constitution, and now the zeitgeist is kind of suspicious anyway. I think it takes some really talented people and the right time to get it passed. So, you can spend a lot of time on it and draft the perfect document. Getting it adopted by the people is going to be very difficult.
And I think we should distinguish between constitutional reform and a constitutional convention.
Right.
We can have a committee, let's say, to study reforming a certain article. And you don't then have to put everything on the table. When the constitutional convention is there, everything's on the table. I want to, Governor Edwards, thank you for having the vision to seek to have this constitutional convention. I think it served us well. And I want to thank Bubba Henry, because the success of the convention would not have been possible but for his leadership, because of his fairness. He was fair. He could not have forced these delegates to do the things they did, but he allowed the process to work, and I think we're benefiting. We see every day, Johnny, you're talking about annexation. Right now we have a city of Central because that convention allowed all parishes to incorporate. They're talking about a city of St. George because of that provision of the Constitution. And every day we see new things that's still playing out, but I thank you, Governor Edwards, for having the vision to make it all possible.
I want to thank you for keeping us from going too far to the left.
Well, does
He's
it?
not through yet.
He's not. Yeah. Does anyone share Mr. Alario's feeling that it's time to put it on the table again for the next gubernatorial election?
Having served as governor, I would say that I personally don't think we need a constitutional convention at this time. However, I think John is correct. It is a subject worthy of debate. And my feeling is more focused than a convention as a whole. It would be reform in certain key areas and limit the discussion to each of those key areas. For example, tax reform. For example, educational structure. For example, the powers of the governor's office, I think, are out of balance, having served there. I think our legislature needs to be stronger and more involved. I think our governor needs to back up. I'm not talking about anybody personally. I said that when I was in the office. I believe that now. This state, in 40 years since the convention, has grown in population less than any state in the South. We are disappearing. When that convention was held, we had 8 congressmen, then 7, now 6. I'll give you the numbers. Texas has grown 125% since the day this convention was passed. We've grown 23%. Florida, 176. Georgia, 109. North Carolina, 88. South Carolina, 86. On and on it goes. Now, the Constitution alone is not going to solve that, but we ought to address reform in certain key areas, and that will help solve it. That's my belief.
Anyone else want to chime in?
I don't think there's an appetite for constitutional revision at this point, but when we completed the draft of this document and it was ratified, I remember Miss Norma Duncan and I talking, and she said, wouldn't it be great if we could take this document now and redraft or draft one that's better? And we have not begun the process of constitutional revision yet in this state, but we didn't write a perfect document. I think we did the absolute best we could do under the circumstances that we had, but it's time for the discussion to begin for constitutional revision and reform, at least in the areas of taxation, I believe, in this state. And how it gets done, I don't know. But Senator, I think you're right. It's time for the discussion to begin, because we have to, we've got to make some corrections or some changes, at least in the revenue and taxation part of the Constitution, I believe.
Governor Edwards, any comments on that?
Well, I agree with everything that Buddy has said. And I want to point out, maybe for a different reason, I don't think the atmosphere and attitude of the people now is ripe for a new constitution, number one. That's from a pure governmental observation. From a personal observation, I'm afraid the state is going a little bit too far to the right, and I'd be concerned about the nature of the document that would be written and approved. Now, there are those who have a different political persuasion who would probably welcome that, but I see that as a movement in the wrong direction. And to the extent that it's possible, not with foresight, but just by circumstance, I think the document we now have provides the right kind of balance between the left and the right, so to speak. And I would be afraid in this environment, and I'm very careful to point out I'm limited to this environment, that it might not be an appropriate time to try to rewrite a constitution.
Considering the debate in the 73 convention concerning the selection of judges and with the influence of uncontrolled campaign spending to influence judicial races, nationally, especially Supreme Court, should a return to appointed judges be considered?
There was some controversy about elected judges and appointed judges, and of course I'm a big believer in elected judges, but a number of states and areas have gone into appointed judges, and I find from my analysis, limited as it is, that it ends up generally with more conservative judges and less involved with the rights of plaintiffs. I mean, you may not agree with that, Judge Dennis, but that's my opinion.
I think you're probably right.
But since you've been elected so many times, you probably go with the election process.
In any event, the people in Louisiana overwhelmingly want elected judges.
Right, I agree.
The convention voted that way. The committee was unanimous on it. There is an argument for the other way, but having served both as an elected judge and appointed judge, I guarantee you, being appointed does not always make for a good judge, because I know some that I served with that I would very readily swap for some of the state judges I served with back in when I was on the state Supreme Court.
I know some that I've served under also.
Well, this person says, how can so many unnecessary new proposed constitutional amendments be stopped?
It's inevitable that we will have a number of constitutional amendments, and that some unnecessary ones will pass, because when you put a proposition on the ballot, if it sounds good, a lot of people will vote for it. And sometimes things are made to sound good on the ballot when they're not really so good. But this is why I think periodically we do need some constitutional reform, either a convention or some effort to sort of look at everything that's passed and see what's necessary and not, because that's the safeguard ultimately that it does need to be reformed and revised from time to time.
The process for getting a constitutional amendment through the legislature is to get a 2/3 vote of both bodies, the House, the Senate, and you got to run the gamut of going through the committee first in the House, and then likewise in the Senate. So it's a pretty good hill to climb. 2/3 vote in this atmosphere is a very, very difficult time, even at the best of times. So it's got to be a pretty good issue that people feel strongly about now, and I think it kind of controls itself. I don't think you don't see 53 amendments like it used to be, Bubba, back in those days, but there is a certain limit just because it's such a difficult hill to climb.
Well, let's keep what we're doing, let's be humble about it. It's just the Constitution. And you say, well, that's pretty important, and it is. But it must be amended. The first 10 amendments to our federal Constitution were the Bill of Rights. Can you imagine a Constitution without it? Abraham Lincoln, when running for president, was asked in Illinois, what's the most important document in America? The Constitution, the reporter asked. He said, no, the Declaration of Independence. It can't be amended, and it doesn't have to be. So we got to be humble. This Constitution we wrote is pretty good. But I think now is the time to look at certain areas of it and see if we need to do a part of it again. That's all I'm saying.
Well, I agree with you, but I've never associated humble with you.
It's a universal problem up here.
That's an oxymoron.
That's an oxymoron.
Well, so this will be the final question, and it is, what do you predict will be the most enduring provision of the Constitution? So you look back on it, and what is the thing that you think is the most significant wording of the Constitution that you were part in writing?
Well, obviously, I think the Bill of Rights is such a strong
I agree.
thing for us all, and I think it speaks to every citizen in this state and puts us all on the same level of what it ought to be. I think it does provide, as I talked about in the beginning, it does provide for a form of government, but it provides a protection for the people from that government, and that's most important. The Bill of Rights certainly does that, and even the tax provisions provide for that protection from
One of the many unsung provisions that I think has done a lot to help is reduction of the powers of the governor. Because when I became governor, I could appoint sheriffs when there was a vacancy, count mayors, senators and others. But now all that has been limited, and if a school board member died or quit while I was governor, I appointed a successor. But now the remaining members of the body are elected, which is better. And I was a big proponent of reducing those powers. But had I known I would be around as long as I have been, I would not have supported that.
I recall when I first started, Bubba was Speaker of the House at the time, and the Governor, Edwards at the time, appointed the Joint Legislative Budget Committee. Every person didn't come from the legislature. Now we've got a different way that's done, but he certainly supported that, and it provided for somewhat of an independence for the legislature, but it still was a giant step, I think, in the right direction.
And the great flaw, to me, in what we did was in the area of gambling. Because we said gambling shall be defined by and suppressed by the legislature. And I don't think anyone in 1973 had any idea that gambling could simply be just redefined as gaming, and that would be accepted by the courts, and that we would have such wide open gambling. I think we just didn't foresee.
Jimmy Stovall did foresee that somehow.
Is that
because right? When we were, my objective was to just get a document. Let's get through with it. And when that language had been adopted, he came to me on the steps on this side of the podium and said, "We have got to change this language."
Tell him who Jimmy was.
Jimmy Stovall had been Jim Dennis Methodist minister prior to the convention, and he was awfully concerned about the change in that language as to what it might do and what the courts might do with it. And in my haste to get through, I said, "Jimmy, just don't. I can guarantee you that's not going to amount to a hill of beans. Don't worry about it." And he's dead now, and he's still worried about it, and I'm sure. But I think you're right. I think it made a heck of a difference.
One of the great things about the Constitutional Convention, I recall, was that it was so open. We could see your conversations. It was we talk about transparency. Well, it was very transparent, and the people of the state, I think, felt that as well. And so it was a great experience for young journalists to cover something as exciting as this, to understand and see all the law these various changes being made before you. And so thank you for that opportunity, and thank you all so much for being part of this. It's been a grand conversation 40 years later, and we thank you all for your service to the citizens of Louisiana. And we mark this moment in time because it is a moment of significance, and We thank you so very much, and we thank you all for watching this conversation.